Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. Today's tale is about Silas Bennett, a young enslaved boy in 1877 who rescued the plantation mistress from a wild bull, and what took place afterwards stunned everyone who saw it. This is a tense and emotional tale, so take a breath, pause, and listen carefully. Before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city and country you're watching from. Your involvement helps keep these tales remembered instead of forgotten. Let's start. The blood was still fresh on his back when they pulled him to the auction block for the second time in his life. Silas Bennett was 16 years old, and he had just discovered the harshest lesson of the American South, that rescuing a white woman's life could be a worse offense than letting her die. This is the tale of a boy who talked to animals better than he talked to men, who committed the unforgivable act of heroism in 1877, Georgia, and who changed from the kindest soul on the Callahan Plantation into something the night itself came to fear. Georgia, 1877. The year the North abandoned the South. Federal soldiers had pulled out 3 months earlier, ending what historians name Reconstruction and what white Southerners named occupation. In Washington, politicians shook hands over a deal that left 4 million freed people to the mercy of their former owners. Rutherford Hayes took the presidency, and the South reclaimed its old customs. For people like Silas Bennett, freedom was a word that lived only on paper turning yellow in some distant courthouse. His father, Moses Bennett, had marked what the white landowners named a sharecropping contract in 1868. Moses couldn't read the paper he signed with an X, but the white man who held the pen promised him it was fair. The contract tied the Bennett family to work Henry Callahan's land until they cleared their share of seed, tools, and the shack they lived in. The debt never got smaller, it only expanded. Every harvest season, Moses would stand in the plantation office while Callahan's overseer, a thin-faced man called Garrett, ran his finger down a ledger and declared the family owed more than they'd made. The cost of seed had risen. The quality of cotton had dropped. There were charges for the mule, charges for the plow, charges for living on land that used to be worked by people who weren't paid at all. Silas had been born into slavery in 1861, too young to recall the war, but old enough to grasp that the chains on his family now were made of paper instead of iron. They cut just as deeply. The Callahan plantation sat in the red clay hills of central Georgia, 0 acres of cotton fields, timber stands, and pasture land. The main house was a white column building that had survived Sherman's march by pure geography, standing proud on a hill that looked over the worker quarters below. 73 families lived on Callahan land in 1877, all of them black, all of them tied by contracts they couldn't read and debts they couldn't clear. But Silas Bennett didn't spend his days in the cotton fields. He had a talent that even Henry Callahan couldn't overlook. The boy could talk to animals, not literally, of course. Silas didn't hear voices or get messages from the spirit world, despite what some of the older workers whispered when they saw him come a wild-eyed stallion with nothing but his hands and his voice. What Silas had was something rarer than magic, something that couldn't be taught or purchased or bred into a person. It was pure understanding, an ability to read an animal's fear in the tension of its muscles, its anger in the flare of its nostrils, its pain in the way it held its weight. He moved among horses, cattle, and dogs, like he was one of them, speaking their language of breath and stance and careful stillness. When Silas was 11 years old, Garrett had brought a new stallion to the plantation, a beautiful black Tennessee Walker that Callahan had bought at auction in Atlanta for $200. The horse was gorgeous and completely wild. It had kicked 2 skilled handlers and bitten a third. Garrett was getting ready to have the animal gelded and broken with the traditional methods used throughout the South, rope, whip, and the systematic crushing of its spirit until nothing remained but obedience born of terror. Silas had been cleaning stalls when he heard the noise in the paddock. He climbed the fence and watched the stallion rear and scream, eyes rolling white with terror. 3 men with ropes were trying to trap it against the back wall. The horse's fear was so thick, Silas could almost taste it, sharp and metallic like blood in his mouth. He'd climbed into the paddock before he'd even thought about what he was doing, moving on pure instinct. The men yelled at him to get out, their voices rough with anger and alarm, but Silas ignored them fully. He walked toward the stallion with empty hands and lowered eyes, making himself small, making himself safe, making himself into something that posed no danger. He didn't approach straight on, but at an angle, giving the horse space to move, space to choose, space to know that flight was still possible. When he got within 10 feet, he started humming, a low, tuneless sound that came from deep in his chest, a vibration more than a melody. The stallion's ears turned toward him like compass needles finding north. Silas stopped moving and kept humming, letting the sound fill the space between them. He didn't look at the horse's eyes, knowing with the certainty of long practice that direct eye contact meant challenge in the animal world, meant threat, meant the possibility of violence. Instead, he watched its feet, its breathing, the slow softening of the muscles in its neck as the terror began to drain away bit by bit. 5 minutes passed in complete silence, except for that low humming. Then 10. The other men stood frozen against the fence, barely breathing, afraid to move and break whatever spell the boy was casting. The stallion took a step towards Silas, then another, its nostrils opening as it caught his scent, and found nothing there to fear. 15 minutes later, Silas had his hand on the horse's neck and was breathing in rhythm with the animal, their lungs rising and falling together like dancers moving to music only they could hear. The men with ropes stood watching, their mouths hanging open in shock at what they just witnessed. Henry Callahan himself had been watching from his spot at the fence, having come down from the main house to check on the progress with his expensive new purchase. He was a tall man, 53 years old in 1877, with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd never questioned his right to command. He'd owned enslaved people before the war and owned their labor still, just under a different name and a different system of accounting. He was not given to displays of feeling or surprise, but what he'd just seen had genuinely impressed him. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet of the paddock. "Boy's got the touch. I've seen men work with horses for 40 years and never develop what that child just did natural." From that day forward, Silas Bennett became the Callahan Plantation's main animal handler, pulled from the cotton fields where his parents and sisters still worked, and given full responsibility for the horses, cattle, and the plantation's pack of hunting dogs. It was better work than picking cotton under the harsh August sun, though Silas was careful never to appear too pleased about his position, never to show too much pride or satisfaction. Showing pleasure in anything was risky for a black boy in Georgia. Happiness could be taken away as fast as it was given, and often was, just to remind you of your place in the order of things. Silas lived for the hours he spent in the stables and pastures, the early mornings and late evenings, when he could work with the animals in relative peace. Animals made sense to him in a way that people never had and probably never would. A horse didn't care about the color of your skin or the circumstances of your birth. A dog didn't change its feelings based on who was watching or what social rules might be broken by simple affection. When a cow was frightened, you could see exactly why and address the cause directly, honestly, without having to navigate the complex and often deadly social codes that ruled every interaction between black and white in the post-war South. Animals were honest in their needs and clear in their communications. They might be dangerous, certainly, their power and instincts making them potentially deadly, but they were never cruel. They never hurt for the sake of hurting. They never punished you for things you didn't do or couldn't control. The same couldn't be said for men, especially white men in Georgia in 1877. Garrett, the overseer, watched Silas with the permanent suspicion that white men of his type carried like a weapon, always loaded, always ready to fire. He was 34 years old, thin as a rail from a constitution that couldn't seem to hold weight no matter how much he ate, with tobacco-stained teeth and a voice like rocks scraping together in a dry riverbed. Before the war, he'd been an overseer of enslaved people on a plantation in South Carolina. After the war, he drifted west to Georgia and found work overseeing sharecroppers. The only difference to him was paperwork and the fact that he couldn't legally kill the workers anymore. Though the convict leasing system that had sprung up across the South provided ways around that for men who understood how the new system really worked. Garrett didn't like that Silas had a special position on the plantation. He didn't like that Henry Callahan sometimes spoke directly to the boy instead of going through proper channels and the established chain of command. Most of all, he didn't like that Silas was good at something Garrett himself could never do, that the boy had a skill that couldn't be learned through violence or intimidation or the assertion of white superiority. Boys got ideas above his station, Garrett told the other white men who worked the plantation. The overseers and foremen who gathered in the equipment shed to drink whiskey and complain about the workers. Thinks he's special because he can sweet-talk a horse, needs to remember his place, remember what he is. But as long as Silas kept the animals healthy and productive, Callahan protected him from Garrett's worst impulses and his desire to cut the boy down to size. The plantation owner was above all things a practical man, more interested in profit than ideology. He'd paid good money for his breeding stock, hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars for individual animals, and the Bennett boy kept them in prime condition. The horses never went lame under Silas's care. The cattle stayed fat and healthy. The dogs were loyal and well-trained, perfect for hunting the deer and wild pigs that roamed the Georgia forests. Silas understood with the clarity of someone whose life depended on it, that his value was measured entirely in dollars and productivity, in the health of animals that were worth more than he would ever be. He was careful in everything he did, methodical and quiet and precise. He did his work and kept his head down and made himself as invisible as possible. He'd learned early that being noticed was dangerous unless you were being noticed for something that made your owner money. The other person who noticed Silas, though for entirely different reasons, was Eleanor Callahan. She was 26 years old in 1008, 177, married to Henry Callahan for 8 years, and deeply lonely in the way that only women of her class and time could be, isolated by the very privileges that were supposed to make her happy. Eleanor had been raised in Savannah society, the daughter of a cotton merchant who'd survived the war by selling to both sides and asking no questions about politics or loyalty. She'd been educated at a finishing school run by French nuns, trained in piano and watercolors, and the elaborate social rituals that ruled the lives of Southern ladies. Her days had been filled with calling cards and tea parties and the careful cultivation of marriageable grace. Her marriage to Henry Callahan had been arranged by their fathers over brandy and cigars in a Savannah gentlemen's club, the two men trading their children like shares in a profitable venture. Henry was 43 at the time, 17 years her senior, a widower whose first wife had died giving birth to a stillborn son. He needed a new wife to manage his household and produce an heir to inherit the plantation. Eleanor's father needed connections to Georgia's planter class to expand his business interests. It was a practical arrangement that benefited everyone except possibly Eleanor herself. They were married in Savannah's Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in the spring of 1008, 169, and Eleanor moved to a plantation 30 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by people who had once been enslaved and white men who spoke of nothing but cotton prices and politics and the glorious lost cause of the Confederacy. She had no friends in this new place, no children despite 8 years of marriage and trying, and a husband who treated her with the same distant politeness he showed to dinner guests and business associates. Henry was not cruel to her. He simply had no particular interest in her beyond her function as the mistress of his household and the potential mother of his heirs. When that function remained unfulfilled year after year, his indifference deepened into something close to disappointment, though he never spoke of it directly. Eleanor spent her days supervising the house servants, arranging flowers in rooms no one visited, playing piano in an empty parlor where the music echoed off the walls, and looking out windows at a world she was forbidden to truly enter. Southern ladies of her class didn't work. They didn't have purpose beyond decoration and the hope of sons. She was a beautiful object in a beautiful house, carefully maintained and deeply useless, and she was dying of it in ways that had no name and no cure. She'd first noticed Silas Bennett 3 years earlier in the summer of 1008, 174, watching from the veranda as the boy worked with a particularly difficult mare in the training paddock. The mare had been abused by her previous owner, a man who'd lost the plantation in a card game and sold off his stock before the new owner could claim it. She would strike out with her hooves at anyone who approached, her eyes rolling white with remembered terror. But the Bennett boy had spent hours, then days, then weeks, just sitting in the paddock with her, not moving, barely breathing, simply being present until the mare got used to his existence. Eleanor had watched the entire process unfold over the course of a month, fascinated despite herself. She'd seen patience and gentleness in the way the boy moved, qualities that were rare in the harsh world of the plantation, where force and dominance were the primary currencies of interaction. She'd seen him succeed where grown men with whips and ropes had failed completely. She'd mentioned it to Henry once over dinner. the two of them sitting at opposite ends of a table designed to seat 20, eating in near silence as they did most nights. "That boy you have working with the horses is quite remarkable," she'd said, her voice sounding too loud in the quiet dining room. Henry had looked up from his roast beef, his expression mildly curious. "Which boy?" he'd asked the young one. "Silas, I believe his name is," Elinor had replied. "Oh, the Bennett boy, yes, he's useful with the animals, got a natural knack for it, saves me money on veterinary bills and lost stock." That had been the extent of the conversation. Henry didn't encourage his wife to take interest in the workers, black or white. It wasn't proper for a lady to concern herself with such things beyond the household servants she directly supervised, but Elinor continued to watch when Silas worked near the house, observing from her windows like a prisoner watching the free world beyond the bars. She never spoke to him directly. The social distance between a plantation mistress and a black worker boy was an unbridgeable canyon, carefully maintained by 1,000 unspoken rules that governed every aspect of Southern life. She simply observed from her elevated position and felt a strange envy for the purpose and skill she saw in his work, for the clear meaning his days seemed to have. At least the boy had something to care about, something that cared back in its way. At least he had a reason to wake up in the morning beyond the empty performance of respectability. Elinor's life was composed entirely of surfaces and appearances, a carefully constructed facade behind which nothing of substance existed. She was 26 years old and already felt like a ghost haunting her own existence. The spring of 1877 brought unusual heat to Georgia, temperatures climbing higher and earlier than anyone could remember. By mid-April, the thermometer on the plantation's main porch was already reaching into the high 80s by midday, and the red clay earth cracked and dried like old leather. Water became precious, tempers shortened. The heat made everything harder, turned simple tasks into ordeals, and brought out the worst in both animals and men. Henry Callahan had invested heavily in expanding his cattle operation over the winter, seeing opportunity where others saw only risk. Cotton prices were unpredictable, subject to the whims of northern textile mills and international markets. But beef was bringing good money from the growing cities of the South, and the railroad connections that now ran through Georgia like veins carrying commerce. He'd purchased a prize breeding bull from a Texas rancher in February, an enormous longhorn that the seller claimed had sired 50 calves in 3 years and possessed the best bloodlines west of the Mississippi. The price had been steep, $300, but Callahan believed in the investment. Good breeding stock would pay for itself many times over. The bull arrived by rail car in early March, and it took 6 men with ropes and poles to unload it from the stock car at the depot. The animal was absolutely massive in size and temperament. It stood nearly 6 feet at the shoulder and weighed close to 2.0 pounds, with horns that spread 5 feet from tip to tip, their points as sharp as cavalry sabers. Its hide was a mottled pattern of brown and white, and its eyes were the color of old amber filled with an intelligence that bordered on calculation, on conscious malice. This was not a tamed animal in any real sense. This was barely contained wildness, power, and rage held in check by nothing but fence posts and the animal's own momentary choice to cooperate. Henry Callahan named it Leviathan after the biblical sea monster, and the name fit perfectly. Silas had been assigned to manage the bull's integration into the plantation's breeding program. a responsibility that filled him with equal parts pride and terror. It was dangerous work under the best circumstances. Bulls were unpredictable at the best of times, driven by instincts that could turn them from calm to violent in a heartbeat. And Leviathan had the added volatility of being in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar animals and unfamiliar humans. The first time Silas approached the bull's pen, Leviathan charged the fence with enough force to crack one of the thick oak support posts. The impact sounded like a gunshot echoing across the barnyard, and Silas had jumped back instinctively. His heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. He stood at a safe distance and studied the animal for a long time, watching how it moved, how it held its massive head, how it reacted to the presence of the other cattle in adjacent pens. This was not like working with horses. Horses were prey animals governed by flight instinct and the desire for safety, for the protection of the herd. Bulls were different creatures entirely. They had the confidence of animals that had few natural predators, the arrogance of power. Leviathan didn't fear humans the way horses did. It tolerated them at best and challenged them at worst, seeing them as potential rivals for dominance rather than threats to flee from. Silas spent weeks just observing the bull, learning its patterns and rhythms. He noticed that Leviathan was calmer in the early morning hours, more aggressive in the heat of the afternoon when the sun beat down and the flies swarmed. The bull had already established a hierarchy with the other cattle, and it would posture and bellow to maintain its dominance, but it didn't actually attack if the other animals showed proper deference and submission. It was testing, always testing, looking for weakness or challenge. Slowly, carefully, moving with the patience he'd learned from years of working with difficult animals, Silas began to enter the bull's space. He never approached directly, never made sudden movements, never did anything that could be interpreted as a challenge or threat. He would enter the large paddock that held Leviathan and several cows, moving along the fence line, giving the bull plenty of room to observe him and make its own choices. He'd scatter feed in the troughs and then retreat immediately. Approach and retreat, always predictable, always slow, always giving the animal time to adjust to his presence. By late April, after nearly 2 months of this patient work, Silas could work in the same paddock as Leviathan without incident. The bull had learned that the boy was not a threat and not a rival, that he represented food and water and the opening of gates to better pasture. They had reached an understanding, a working relationship based on routine and predictability. But understanding was not the same as trust, and Silas never forgot for a moment that wild animals could turn in a heartbeat, that all his careful work could be undone by a single wrong move or an unexpected sound. The morning of April 28th, 177, started like any other morning on the Callahan plantation. Silas woke before dawn in the one-room cabin he shared with his parents and younger sister Maya. The cabin was cramped and dark with a dirt floor and walls made from rough-cut pine that had warped and shrunk over the years, leaving gaps that let in the cold in winter and the heat in summer. His father was already gone to the cotton fields, leaving before first light as he did every day during the growing season. His mother, Ruth, was stirring cornmeal mush over the small fire, preparing the only meal the family would eat until evening. The cabin smelled of smoke and fatigue and the particular poverty that no amount of work could seem to lift. "You be careful with that devil bull today," Ruth said as Silas pulled on his work boots, the leather cracked and stiff from age. She said the same thing every morning, and every morning Silas gave the same response, the ritual as much a part of their routine as the meal she was preparing. "Yes, Mama," he replied. "That animal ain't natural," Ruth continued, her voice low and worried. "Got the devil's own temper. I seen the way it looks at people. Ain't right. I'm careful, Mama. I know what I'm doing." Ruth turned from the fire and looked at her son, really looked at him in the dim light of early morning. At 16, he was already taller than she was, with his father's broad shoulders and her own dark eyes. He'd grown into someone she hardly recognized sometimes, transformed from the child she'd nursed through fevers and hunger into a young man who moved through the dangerous world of the plantation with careful grace and quiet competence. "I know you are, baby," she said softly, "but careful don't always matter when you dealing with beasts and white folks. Both of them can turn on you for no reason at all, and there ain't nothing you can do but pray and run." Silas kissed his mother's cheek, feeling the papery texture of her skin, aged beyond her 38 years by work and worry and the grinding stress of never having enough. He headed out into the Preed, on darkness, walking the familiar path from the quarters to the main complex of barns and stables. His breath misted in the cool air, and somewhere in the distance he could hear roosters beginning to crow, announcing the coming day. The world was quiet in that brief window between night and morning, and Silas loved this time above all others. These were the hours when he had the animals to himself, when the white men were still sleeping off their whiskey, and the other workers were just beginning to stir. He could work in peace, moving through his routines without supervision or comment, or the constant awareness of being watched and judged. Silas fed the horses first, as he always did, measuring out oats and hay with careful precision, checking water troughs to make sure they were full and clean, running his hands over legs and backs and necks to check for heat or swelling that might indicate injury or illness. Then he moved to the cattle pens, counting heads to make sure none had escaped or died during the night, looking for any signs of sickness or distress in the herd. When he reached Leviathan's paddock, he stopped and felt his stomach drop. The bull was standing in the center of the enclosure, absolutely motionless, its massive head lowered almost to the ground. Something was wrong. Silas could see it in the animal's posture, in the way it was holding its weight. He approached the fence carefully, moving slowly, and studied the bull from a safe distance. Leviathan's breathing was labored, its sides heaving with each breath. Foam flecked its muzzle, hanging in white strings. One of the rear legs was held at an odd angle, not bearing full weight, suggesting injury or pain. Silas's mind raced through possibilities, running down the mental checklist he'd developed over years of animal care. Injury from the fence, snake bite, poison from bad feed or contaminated water. He needed to get closer to assess the problem properly, but Leviathan in pain would be even more dangerous than usual. Injured animals were unpredictable, driven by survival instinct and fear rather than any kind of reason or learned behavior. Pain made them wild again, stripped away the thin veneer of domestication. Silas climbed the fence and dropped into the paddock, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. The bull's head came up immediately, and those amber eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle with instinctive alarm. Leviathan took a lurching step forward, clearly favoring the injured leg, and released a low bellow that sounded like thunder rolling across the distant hills. "Easy now," Silas said softly, keeping his voice calm and level despite the fear crawling up his spine. "Easy, boy. I'm here to help you. Just let me see what's wrong." He moved slowly to the side, trying to get an angle where he could see the injured leg properly. As he moved, he kept talking, that same low, crooning tone he used with frightened horses. The words themselves meaningless, but the tone carrying everything. The words didn't matter, they never did. The tone was everything, the emotion behind the sound. Leviathan tracked him with its head, muscles bunching beneath that mottled hide, preparing for something. Silas could see the problem now. There was a long, jagged gash on the bull's left rear leg just above the hock joint. It looked fresh, probably from catching the leg on a broken fence board during the night, one of the hundreds of small maintenance issues that plagued any working plantation. The wound was bleeding, but not severely, a slow seep rather than an arterial flow. It needed to be cleaned and treated with one of the poultices Silas prepared from herbs and lamp oil, but it wasn't life-threatening. The problem was getting close enough to treat it without being killed in the process. "You got yourself hurt, didn't you, boy?" Silas continued his soft patter, taking another careful step forward. "We're going to fix that, going to make it better, but you got to let me help you. You got to trust me." He took another step forward, his hands extended and empty, showing the bull he carried no weapons, no ropes, nothing threatening. Leviathan exploded into motion without warning. The bull charged with a speed that seemed physically impossible for an animal that size, going from standing still to full attack in less than a second. One moment it was simply standing there, and the next it was a 2,000-pound missile of muscle and horn heading straight for Silas with the clear intention of killing him. Silas ran for his life, sprinting toward the fence with every ounce of speed his 16-year-old body could produce. His boots slipped in the loose dirt of the paddock. He could hear the thunder of hooves behind him, could feel the heat of the bull's breath on his back, could hear the rasp of its breathing. He hit the fence at full speed and vaulted it in one desperate motion, tumbling over the top rail and landing hard on the other side, rolling through the dirt and coming up gasping for breath. Leviathan hit the fence a half-second later with enough force to splinter two of the thick oak rails. The bull's horns punched through the wood like it was paper, missing Silas's previous position by mere inches. The animal bellowed its rage and frustration, pawing the ground, tossing its massive head. The injured leg seemed completely forgotten in the fury of the moment. Silas lay in the dirt, his heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps that had been close, too close. He'd nearly been killed, and only blind luck and youth and the split-second timing of his vault had saved him. "Boy, what the hell's going on here?" Garrett's voice cut through the morning air like a knife. The overseer was striding across the yard from the direction of his quarters, pulling his suspenders up over his undershirt, his face already twisted with anger even before he knew what had happened. Anger was Garrett's default state, the baseline from which all other emotions departed and to which they always returned. Silas got to his feet quickly, brushing dirt from his clothes. "The bull's injured, sir. Cut his leg on something in the night. He's agitated and dangerous." Garrett looked at the damaged fence and the bellowing Leviathan beyond it, then turned his narrowed gaze back to Silas. "You antagonize that animal," he demanded. "No, sir. I was just trying to check the injury to see how bad it was." don't look like checking to me." Garrett interrupted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt near Silas's feet. "Looks like you got him riled up and nearly got yourself killed. Mister, Callahan paid $300 for that bull. He finds out you've been mistreating his stock. There'll be hell to pay." "I wasn't mistreating him, sir. I was trying to help. Don't sass me, boy." Garrett's hand moved to the coiled whip on his belt, a casual gesture that carried volumes of threat. The whip was always there, always within reach, a constant reminder of the violence that underpinned every interaction. "You go on and get the other animals fed. I'll deal with the bull myself, get some real men to handle it proper." Silas wanted desperately to explain that Leviathan was injured and frightened, that approaching him now would be dangerous for anyone, regardless of their color or experience, that the bull needed time to calm down before anyone tried to treat the wound. But he knew better than to argue with Garrett. Arguing only made things worse, only gave the overseer an excuse to escalate, to assert his authority through violence. Silas ducked his head in the posture of submission that had been beaten into him over 16 years, and moved away quickly, heading toward the horse stables. Behind him he heard Garrett calling for other men to help with the bull, his voice harsh and commanding. The day grew hotter as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the temperature rising degree by degree until the air itself seemed to shimmer and warp. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the thermometer on the plantation's main porch was already reading 92 degrees, and there wasn't a breath of wind to provide relief. The plantation moved at the slower pace that heat demanded, men seeking shade where they could find it, animals standing listless in their pens with their heads down. Henry Callahan had business in town and had left early in his carriage, taking his driver and his account books to meet with the banker about loans for the coming season. That left Garrett in charge of the plantation, a situation that made everyone nervous, black and white alike. The overseer had a mean streak that Callahan's presence usually kept in check, but when the boss was away, Garrett's true nature came out to play. Eleanor Callahan was in the main house, trapped in the prison of her corset and petticoats and the 3 layers of clothing that propriety demanded even in killing heat. She'd spent the morning reviewing household accounts with Bessie, the head house servant, going over expenditures for candles and soap and flour in a ritual that served no real purpose beyond filling the empty hours. The tedium of it, combined with the oppressive temperature, had given her a vicious headache that pounded behind her eyes like a hammer on an anvil. She decided to take a walk through the gardens before lunch, hoping that movement and fresh air might ease the pain, though the air outside was hardly fresh, just hot and still and heavy. The gardens on the Callahan plantation were Eleanor's one creative outlet, the single area where Henry allowed her full control and didn't question her decisions or expenditures. She'd spent years developing them, importing rose bushes from Charleston and azaleas from Savannah, creating intricate paths and carefully planned beds that provided color from early spring through late fall. It was a small sanctuary of beauty in the harsh landscape of the plantation, a place where she could pretend for a few minutes that she was something more than an ornament in her husband's house. She walked the shaded paths between flowering beds, her parasol providing meager relief from the brutal sun. She was thinking about nothing in particular, her mind mercifully empty of the usual stream of worry and loneliness and regret, when she heard the commotion from the direction of the cattle pens. Men's voices raised in alarm and panic, the sound of wood splintering and crashing, and beneath it all a roar that made the ground vibrate beneath her feet, a sound of pure animal rage, that triggered something primal in her hindbrain. Eleanor's headache disappeared instantly, replaced by a spike of pure adrenaline that made her heart race and her breath come short. She knew that sound. She'd heard Leviathan bellow before during feeding times when the bull was establishing dominance over the other cattle. But this was different. This was not a challenge or a warning. This was fury. She should have returned immediately to the house, should have sent Bessie to find out what was happening while she waited in the safety and propriety of the parlor. A lady had no business near the working areas of a plantation, and certainly no business near agitated livestock. But curiosity and boredom and 8 years of stifling constraints pushed her forward instead of back. She walked toward the cattle pens, staying on the path that ran along the eastern fence line, partially hidden from direct view by a row of magnolia trees that provided blessed shade. She reached a gap in the trees and looked through at the scene unfolding in the main yard. What she saw was absolute chaos. Leviathan was free in the main workyard, having apparently broken through the weakened section of fence that his earlier charge had damaged. The bull was in full fury, its injured leg apparently not hindering its movement at all. 4 men with ropes were trying to corner it against the barn wall, but the animal was having none of it. As Eleanor watched from her hidden position, Leviathan charged one of the men, a field hand whose name she didn't know. The man barely managed to dive behind a water trough, his body hitting the dirt hard. The bull's horns caught the wooden trough and flipped it like it weighed nothing, sending 100 gallons of water spraying across the yard in a glittering arc. This was madness. The men were going to get killed. And then Eleanor's attention was drawn to a 5th figure, separate from the men with ropes, standing near the horse stable with something in his hands. It was Silas Bennett, shirtless in the heat, holding a wooden bucket. Eleanor watched as the boy took a step toward the rampaging bull, then stopped, his entire body tense with indecision. He looked toward the men, toward the bull, clearly trying to decide something, calculating odds and possibilities. Then he started walking forward, the bucket held in front of him, his posture deliberately non-threatening, his movements slow and predictable. What was the boy doing? Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat as she watched Silas move closer to the enraged bull. Garrett saw him too, and his voice cracked across the yard like a whip. "Boy, you get back. This ain't your concern." But Silas ignored him completely, his attention focused entirely on Leviathan. He kept walking forward with that strange confidence. Eleanor had seen him use with difficult animals before, that quality of absolute calm that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a stove. The bucket swung slightly in his hands, and Eleanor could see now that it was filled with feed, the grain catching the sunlight. The bull saw him coming and wheeled to face this new challenge, this small figure approaching when everything else was running away. Leviathan lowered its massive head, those 5-foot horns pointing forward like the lances of cavalry soldiers preparing to charge. Foam dripped from its muzzle, and its eyes were wild, showing white around the amber irises. "Silas, no." The shout came from one of the other workers, a man Eleanor didn't recognize, his voice high with fear. But the boy kept walking, as if he hadn't heard, as if the entire world had narrowed down to just him and the bull. He was talking now. Eleanor could see his lips moving, though she couldn't hear the words over the general commotion and the thundering of her own heartbeat in her ears. He was maybe 20 feet from the bull now, then 15. The distance closing with each careful step. Leviathan pawed the ground with one massive hoof, throwing up clouds of red Georgia dust that hung in the still air. The animal's entire body was tense, like a spring wound too tight. every muscle visible beneath that mottled hide. 10 feet now. Silas set the bucket down on the ground with careful deliberation and took 2 steps backward. His hands held out to the sides, empty and open, showing he carried no weapons, posed no threat. The bull stared at the boy with an intensity that seemed almost human in its focus, almost conscious in its calculation, and Elena realized with a strange detachment that she was watching someone who might be about to die, and she couldn't look away, couldn't move, couldn't even breathe properly. The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight, like a string on a violin tuned past its breaking point. The entire yard had gone silent, every man frozen in place, afraid to move and break whatever spell was holding the scene together. Even the other animals seemed to sense something, the horses in the nearby stable going quiet, the chickens in their coops stopping their constant clucking. Then Leviathan took a step forward, not a charge, just a step. A single placement of one massive hoof, then another. The bull moved toward the bucket, its eyes still fixed on Silas, watching for any sign of threat or deception. Another step. The distance closed to 8 feet, then 6. The massive head lowered toward the bucket, and the bull began to eat, its teeth grinding the grain with a sound like millstones. The men with ropes stood absolutely frozen, their mouths hanging open, afraid to breathe too loudly and break the moment. Silas took another careful step backward, then another, creating distance while the bull was distracted and focused on the food. He was letting Leviathan calm down while occupied with eating, using the animal's own instincts to diffuse the situation. It was working. Elena released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease slightly, and that's when everything went catastrophically wrong. One of the men with ropes, perhaps thinking the moment was right to secure the bull, perhaps simply panicking and acting without thought, threw his loop toward Leviathan's horns. The rope sailed through the air and slapped across the bull's face with a sound like a hand striking flesh. Leviathan exploded out of the bucket with a roar that Elena felt in her bones, a sound of pure betrayed rage. The bull charged, not toward the man with the rope who was already scrambling backward, but toward the nearest target, the figure that had been slowly retreating toward Silas. The boy tried to run, but he was too close, had sacrificed distance for the sake of calming the animal. Leviathan covered the gap in 2 enormous strides, its head lowering, those massive horns swinging up in a motion designed by millennia of evolution to gore and toss and kill. Silas jumped to the side at the last possible second, his body moving with the reflexes of youth and desperation. The horn caught his shirt and tore it clean off his body, the fabric shredding like paper, but miraculously didn't touch skin. He hit the ground hard and rolled, scrambling on hands and knees to get away, to put distance between himself and death. The bull wheeled for another pass, murder in its amber eyes, and Elena Callahan did something that changed the course of 3 lives forever. She screamed. It was a high, piercing sound of pure terror that cut through the chaos like a knife through silk, carrying across the yard with shocking clarity. She hadn't meant to make any sound at all, had been simply watching in frozen horror, but the scream tore itself from her throat without conscious thought or permission. Leviathan's head swiveled toward the new sound, the bull's attention shifting instantly from the boy on the ground to this new stimulus. The animal saw movement in the magnolia trees, something white and moving among the green shadows, something that fled. Elena's scream had been instinctive, but her flight was pure panic, the product of millions of years of prey evolution kicking in and overriding all rational thought. She turned to run back toward the house, back to safety, but her skirts tangled around her legs, and her parasol fell from nerveless fingers. Behind her, close enough that she could feel it in the ground beneath her feet, she heard the thunder of hooves. The bull was coming for her. Leviathan crashed through the magnolia trees like they were grass, like they were nothing more than minor obstacles in the way of its rage. Branches snapped, and bark flew in all directions, and leaves rained down like green snow. Elena could hear it gaining on her with every stride, could hear the wet rasp of its breathing and the sound of its hooves hitting the earth like hammers. She was going to die. The thought came with absolute clarity and a strange calm that settled over her terror. She was going to die out here in the garden she'd spent years cultivating, killed by an animal because she'd been stupid enough to scream, to draw attention to herself. Her foot caught on a root hidden beneath the grass, and she fell, hitting the ground hard enough to drive all the air from her lungs in an explosive gasp. She rolled onto her back instinctively, some part of her wanting to see death coming rather than take it in the back, and saw 0 pounds of rage bearing down on her. The bull was so close she could see individual details with terrible clarity. The blood-red veins in the whites of its eyes, the foam and saliva dripping from its muzzle, the wicked sharp points of those horns that were about to punch through her body and pin her to the Georgia clay like a butterfly in a collector's case. Time slowed to individual heartbeats, to the space between seconds, and Elena found herself thinking about her mother in Savannah, about the piano in the empty parlor, about all the things she'd never done and never would do now. And then something slammed into Elena from the side with enough force to knock her sideways, driving her out of the path of Leviathan's charge. She caught a confused image of dark skin and terrified eyes, and realized it was Silas Bennett, throwing his body between her and the bull, grabbing her around the waist with both arms and rolling them both toward the massive trunk of an ancient oak tree. Leviathan's horn caught Silas's shoulder as they moved, the point slicing through skin and muscle, opening a gash that immediately welled with bright arterial blood. But the boy's momentum carried them clear of the main impact. They slammed against the oak tree trunk as the bull thundered past, unable to stop its charge, its hooves tearing up great chunks of earth. Elena lay on the ground with Silas's body half covering hers, his blood dripping onto her white dress in spreading crimson flowers. Her ears were ringing and her heart was trying to break through her ribs, and she couldn't seem to form a coherent thought beyond the simple fact that she was alive when she should be dead. The boy pushed himself up on his arms, looking down at her with wide eyes that showed more white than brown. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Ma'am, can you hear me?" His voice came from what seemed like a great distance, muffled and strange. Elena couldn't speak. She could only stare up at this 16-year-old boy who had just risked his life to save hers, whose blood was dripping onto her dress from the wound in his shoulder, whose hands had touched her in ways that would scandalize every person on this plantation. Behind them, Leviathan had wheeled around and was preparing for another charge, pawing the ground, lowering its head. The bull had tasted violence now and wanted more, wanted to finish what it had started. "Stay down," Silas said, his voice suddenly calm despite the terror Elena could see in his eyes. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly, and stepped away from Elena, putting his body between her and the charging bull once again. What happened next would be told and retold in the quarters for years to come, growing with each telling until it took on the quality of legend, of myth, of something that couldn't possibly be true, but was witnessed by too many people to deny. Silas Bennett, shirtless and bleeding, his shoulder torn open and streaming blood down his chest, stepped away from the oak tree and walked directly toward the charging bull. He spread his arms wide, making himself as large as possible, and from somewhere deep in his chest he produced a sound that Elinor had never heard a human throat make before. It was a roar, primal and terrifying, the sound of a creature refusing to be prey, refusing to submit, refusing to die. It carried across the yard and seemed to shake the very air, seemed to make the ground vibrate with its intensity, and Leviathan, impossibly, miraculously, stopped. The bull pulled up short, maybe 10 feet from Silas, its head swinging back and forth in confusion. This prey that should run was instead advancing. This small creature was making the sounds of a predator, of something that challenged rather than fled. Silas held his ground, still making that terrible roaring sound, his arms still spread wide, his body language broadcasting dominance and threat, an absolute refusal to yield. The bull took a step backward, then another, the fight visibly draining from its massive body. Silas advanced, still roaring, the sound continuous and unwavering, pulled from some well of courage or desperation that Elinor couldn't begin to understand. Leviathan backed away from him, the rage fading from its eyes, replaced by something else. Uncertainty, recognition, this was the human who brought food and water, the human who moved slow and safe, the human who was part of the herd hierarchy. The bull stopped retreating and simply stood there, its sides heaving with exertion, foam still dripping from its muzzle. Silas stopped roaring. He lowered his arms slowly, carefully, and took a deep breath that made his whole body shudder. "Easy now," he said, his voice returning to that familiar calm tone, despite the blood still streaming from his shoulder. "Easy, Leviathan. It's done. It's over. You're all right now." The men with ropes were approaching cautiously now, moving slowly, ready to act if needed, but clearly hoping they wouldn't be. Silas walked up to the bull and placed his hand on the massive head, right between those deadly horns, in a gesture of such casual bravery that it made Elinor's breath catch all over again. Leviathan allowed the touch, even leaned into it slightly, seeking the comfort of familiar contact. "Good boy," Silas whispered, so quietly that Elinor almost didn't hear it from her position on the ground. "Good boy. I know you're scared. I know it hurts. We're going to help you now." He turned to look back at Elinor, still on the ground by the oak tree, her white dress stained with dirt and blood, her hair fallen from its careful arrangement, her entire body shaking with reaction to what had just happened. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment that stretched into something beyond time, they were just two people who had survived something terrible together. Not mistress and worker, not white and black, not the carefully maintained categories and hierarchies that governed every aspect of Southern life. Just two humans who had looked at death and somehow, impossibly, lived to speak of it. Then the moment shattered like glass under a hammer. "What in the name of God is happening here?" Garrett's voice cracked across the yard with the force of a thunderclap. The overseer came running through the trampled magnolia grove, his narrow face purple with rage or heat or both, his hand already moving toward the pistol at his belt. He took in the scene with eyes that saw only what he expected to see, what he'd been trained by culture and prejudice to see. Elinor Callahan on the ground, her dress disarrayed and torn, her hair loose and wild, her pale skin marked with dirt. Silas Bennett standing over her, shirtless and bloodied, close enough to touch her, his hands that had just been on her body still stained with her blood and his own. The bull calm beside him, the crisis apparently over. Garrett's hand closed on his pistol and pulled it from the holster in one smooth motion. The gun came up and pointed directly at Silas's chest, the barrel unwavering. "Step away from Mrs. Callahan, boy, right now. Do it slow." Silas's hands went up immediately in the universal gesture of surrender, the movement so automatic it might have been carved into his bones after 16 years of surviving in a world where hesitation could mean death. "Sir, I was just trying to help her. The bull was charging, and I said, step away." Garrett's voice rose to a shout, spittle flying from his lips. "You think I'm blind? You think I can't see what's in front of my face?" Silas moved back quickly, his hands still raised, his eyes fixed on the gun that could end his life with a single twitch of Garrett's finger. The other men were gathering now, drawn by the commotion, forming a rough circle around the scene. White men from the fields, overseers and foremen, their faces hard with suspicion and anger. They saw what Garrett saw. They drew the same conclusions. Garrett crossed to Elena and offered his hand, pulling her to her feet with exaggerated gentleness, making a show of his concern. "Mrs. Callahan, are you injured? Did he hurt you? Did that boy put his hands on you?" Elena was shaking, the shock and terror of the last few minutes catching up with her all at once, making her legs weak and her thoughts scattered. She opened her mouth to explain that Silas had saved her life, that the boy was a hero who deserved gratitude and reward, that he'd risked everything to protect her from the bull. The words were right there, formed and ready to speak. But before she could get them out, she saw something that made them die in her throat, like flowers touched by frost. More men were arriving now, pulled from their work by the noise and excitement, forming an ever larger circle around the scene. White men with sun-weathered faces and hard eyes, men who'd fought for the Confederacy and lost, men who'd owned other human beings and resented bitterly that they couldn't anymore. They were looking at Silas Bennett with expressions that Elena recognized from her years in the South, from countless social gatherings and conversations. They saw what Garrett saw, a black boy and a white woman in a compromising position, her dress torn and stained with blood, his hands that had touched her body. The truth didn't matter to these men. The actual events of the last 10 minutes didn't matter. What mattered was the story they would tell, the conclusion they had already reached before asking a single question, before seeking any explanation. Elena felt the weight of that collective gaze like a physical thing pressing down on her shoulders. She understood in that instant, with a clarity that was almost painful, what her silence would mean for Silas Bennett. But she also understood with equal clarity what the truth would mean for her. If she told them what really happened, she would have to admit she'd been near the cattle pens when she had no business being there. She would have to admit that her scream had provoked the bull's charge, that she was responsible for the chaos and danger. She would have to admit that a black boy had touched her, had grabbed her around the waist, had pressed his body against hers, had held her in his arms, even if only for seconds and only to save her life. Even in gratitude, even in testimony to his heroism, the mere description of those facts would ruin her in ways she couldn't fully articulate, but understood instinctively. The other plantation wives would whisper about it at their social gatherings, their fans fluttering in front of their faces as they discussed in hushed tones how Elena Callahan had been handled by a Negro boy. Society would judge her, would find her somehow complicit, somehow to blame for allowing herself to be in a position where such a thing could happen. Her reputation, the only currency she possessed in this world, would be shattered by the truth more surely than by any lie. And Henry, what would Henry think, knowing that his wife had been held in a black boy's arms, had felt his hands on her body? Would he believe it was innocent, necessary, heroic? Or would some part of him wonder, would some whisper of doubt poison their already distant marriage? Elena looked at Silas and saw the boy's eyes pleading with her silently to speak, to tell them what had actually happened, to save him the way he'd saved her. She looked at Garrett, at the other white men pressing closer, at the gun still pointed at Silas's chest. She looked down at her own trembling hands, stained with the boy's blood that he'd shed protecting her, and Elena Callahan, daughter of Savannah society, wife of a plantation owner, keeper of all the rules that governed her narrow and carefully circumscribed life, made her choice. It wasn't a conscious decision so much as a surrender to forces larger than herself, to the weight of social expectations and the fear of consequences she couldn't control. I was walking in the gardens. She began, her voice barely above a whisper, each word feeling like a stone she was swallowing, and the bull, it came through the trees, it frightened me terribly, not exactly a lie, but not the truth either. The truth bent and twisted to protect herself while throwing Silas to the wolves. Garrett's eyes narrowed, sensing something unspoken, some crack in the story he could wedge open. "Did this boy touch you, ma'am? Did he put his hands on you? Say no." A voice screamed in Eleanor's head. Just say no, and this can all be over. Deny it happened and save him. But if she said no, how would she explain the blood on her dress? How would she explain being on the ground, disheveled and terrified, with Silas standing over her? The men had seen them, they'd drawn their conclusions. Denying the obvious would only make her look like she was hiding something worse. Eleanor's voice broke, and she hated herself for it, hated the weakness. Hated what she was about to do. He startled me. 3 words, just 3 simple words. Not an accusation exactly, not a direct claim that he'd done anything wrong, but not a defense either, not the testimony that could save him. 3 words that hung in the air like a noose waiting for a neck. "He startled you," Garrett repeated slowly, his voice dripping with satisfaction and a kind of vicious triumph. He turned to look at Silas with an expression of pure malice. "You hear that, boy? You startled Mrs. Callahan. What were you doing getting close enough to startle her?" "No, sir. I was trying to help her. The bull was charging right at her, and I pushed her out of the way." Silas's voice was desperate now, pleading, trying to make them understand. "You shut your goddamn mouth," Garrett snarled, taking a step toward him with the gun still raised. "I saw you standing over her with my own eyes, saw you with your filthy hands on her. You got some explaining to do, and it better be good. The bull was charging. I was trying to save her life." Silas's voice rose in desperation and fear, the careful deference and submission cracking under the weight of injustice. Garrett's pistol came up higher, the barrel now pointed directly at Silas's face. "I said, shut your mouth. You think we're stupid. You think we don't know what we saw. You were standing over a white woman with your hands on her body. Now, I don't care what story you want to tell, but that's what happened." Eleanor wanted to speak. The words were there, crowding her throat, demanding to be said. "He saved my life. He's a hero. He did nothing wrong." But her throat had closed completely. Her voice was gone, stolen by fear and social conditioning and the terrible weight of consequences. She stood there, mute, a spectator to a tragedy of her own creation, watching as her silence condemned a boy who had risked everything to protect her. The other white men had moved closer now, forming a tight circle around Silas, cutting off any possibility of escape. The boy stood in the center with his hands still raised, blood still running down his chest from the wound in his shoulder that he'd gotten saving Eleanor's life. He looked at Eleanor one more time, his eyes holding no anger or accusation, just a terrible understanding that made her want to weep. He knew what her silence meant, he knew what was coming, and he knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Get a rope," Garrett said to one of the men, his voice calm now, business, like the voice of a man who'd done this before and would do it again. "We're going to sort this out proper once Mr. Callahan gets back from town. Until then, we make sure this boy don't run off or try anything else stupid." They bound Silas's hands behind his back with rough hemp rope, tying the knots so tight his fingers went numb within minutes. They marched him across the yard toward the old whipping post that still stood near the equipment shed, a thick post of seasoned oak that had been sunk deep into the ground during the days when such things were legal and ordinary, and considered necessary for the maintenance of discipline. It was still used occasionally for the worst offenses, though now it was done quietly, without the public spectacle that had characterized the antebellum period. Eleanor watched them lead him away, his bare back straight despite everything, his head held high. She wanted to run after them, to explain, to make this right, to undo the terrible thing her silence had done, but her legs wouldn't move, her voice wouldn't work. She stood frozen in place, like a statue, a monument to cowardice and self-preservation. Bessie appeared at her elbow, the older woman's face grave with understanding and something that might have been pity. "Mrs. Callahan, let's get you inside now, get you cleaned up and proper. You've had a terrible fright." Eleanor let herself be led back to the house like a child, up the front steps, through the grand entrance hall, up the sweeping staircase to her bedroom. Bessie helped her out of the ruined dress, brought warm water in a porcelain basin and soft cloths to wash away the dirt and blood. "Don't you worry about none of this, ma'am," Bessie said quietly as she worked, her dark hands gentle on Eleanor's pale skin. "It'll all get sorted out. Mr. Callahan will handle it when he gets back." But Eleanor couldn't stop worrying. She moved to the window, still in her undergarments, and looked out over the plantation grounds. Through the wavy glass she could see the whipping post, could see Silas tied there in the full sun, still bare-chested, the wound in his shoulder still bleeding slowly, the blood dark against his skin. "Don't you look at that, ma'am," Bessie said gently, trying to guide Eleanor away from the window with soft hands on her shoulders. "That ain't nothing for you to see, ain't nothing you need to concern yourself with." But Eleanor couldn't look away. This was her doing. Her silence had put him there. The least she could do was witness what came next, was bear the weight of watching what her cowardice had wrought. She stood at the window in her undergarments, not caring about propriety any more, and watched as Garrett paced in front of Silas like a predator circling wounded prey. The overseer was waiting for Henry Callahan to return from town, building his case in his mind, preparing his story, deciding how to present this situation to maximum advantage. A story where Silas Bennett was the villain instead of the hero. A story where Eleanor's silence had condemned a boy who had saved her life. A story where truth mattered less than the preservation of the social order that kept white men in power and black men in chains, whether those chains were made of iron or debt or the constant threat of violence. The afternoon sun beat down on the red Georgia clay with merciless intensity, the temperature climbing past 95 degrees. Silas stood tied to the post with no shade, no water, the sun baking his skin and the flies swarming around the wound in his shoulder. In the distance, thunder rumbled as a storm built over the western hills, but it would arrive too late to provide any relief, too late to wash away what had been done on this terrible day. Elena watched from her window and felt something break inside her, some foundation of her self-image cracking under the weight of what she'd done. She'd always thought of herself as a good person, kind and compassionate, better than the cruel Slay, owning society she'd been born into. But when the moment came to prove it, when it cost her something to tell the truth, she'd failed completely. She'd traded a boy's life for her reputation, and both of them would have to live with that choice for whatever time remained to them. Henry Callahan returned to his plantation at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, his carriage kicking up clouds of red dust on the long drive from town. He'd spent the day negotiating with the banker about loans for the coming season, and had secured favorable terms. He was in good spirits, thinking about the expansion of his cattle operation, about the money that Leviathan and his offspring would bring in over the coming years. He noticed the unusual number of men gathered near the equipment shed as his carriage rolled past, noticed Garrett standing like a sentry near something at the center of the group. Callahan climbed down from the carriage and walked toward the gathering with long strides, his boots crunching in the dry dirt. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice carrying the automatic authority of a man accustomed to command. Garrett stepped forward, his face carefully arranged in an expression of concern and righteous anger. "Mr. Callahan, sir, we've had an incident, a serious incident involving the bull and Mrs. Callahan." Callahan's expression changed instantly, the good humor draining away. "Is Elena hurt? Where is she?" "She's in the house, sir. She's shaken up, but not seriously injured, thank the Lord. But there's something you need to know about what happened." Garrett proceeded to tell his version of the story, a carefully edited narrative that emphasized Silas standing over Elena with his